So our main topic for this week is going to be cells, and they're also known as the basic unit of life. So this is called the cell theory. There's going to have a few little pieces to it, and what we really consider important is that all things are composed of one or more cell. That's one of the key definitions for something's living. Is it made of cells? This is why we don't consider like fire or water or the wind or stuff like that to be alive, because they don't use cells. All living things on Earth use cells. Cells are the basic structure and functional units of life. So you can break the cells down into smaller pieces, which is what we'll be doing in a minute, but we typically consider cells to be the basic structure. And all cells come from pre-existing cells. So in order to get a new cell, it has to come from a previous cell. So very important. And when we talk about cell division, we're going to show you how that works. And so those are the three main ideas behind cell theory. Now we have generally two kinds of cells. We have these guys, and we're trying to figure out what kind of cells they are. So if you think you know the answer, you can just say it out loud. I know you're listening to this as a video and watching it, but hey, why not, right? So this one has no cell walls, where this one has a thick cell wall. So what kind of cells are these? Okay, so we'll figure it out. See, they look different, but they're both cells. So we'll kind of get to that, see if we can figure it out. So we have different kinds of cells. All right. So here is just a picture of a plant. I don't even know what kind of plant it is, but you would have the flower cells at the top, and they look very much different from the stem cells, or the cells in the stem. Let's not call them stem cells because that's a different issue. And then the cells that are in the stem would look different than the cells in the root, which would look different than the cells in the leaf. So just this little plant here has a bunch of different kinds of cells. Here is some human cells under a microscope. Right? So like cartilage and muscle tissue, epidermis, neural tissue, adipose tissue, gut-like epitheliums. Right, so I mean, you got some skin cells, some fat cells, some connective tissue here, some muscles, right, skin. Okay, so even in the human, here's just 6 pictures of different kinds of cells, and we do have tons of different other kinds of cells in humans. All right, these ones. These are very interesting cells. These are red blood cells. They kind of look like hollowed out donuts, or rather donuts with a little kind of piece left in it. And they're actually like that because if you do the math, it's probably the most efficient way to have the most surface area with the smallest amount of volume. And since, as we'll discover later, they transport oxygen, you want as much surface area as you can get. In fact, there's a disease where they don't actually make that shape, and it actually has a pretty big impact on people, and sometimes can be fatal just because the shape of that cell is not correct. So keep that in mind. The shape of the cell actually matters. Now what we're going to do is, if we go back up to these pictures, you see how we have these little shapes inside the cells? Okay, what we call those is organelles. And we're going to go through and look at and talk about some of the organelles here. So let's go ahead. The first organelle, the most important one, is the cell membrane. And that's the cover on the outside of the cell. Okay, it's what we call a phospholipid bilayer. I wouldn't expect you to memorize that, but I mean, you got these little top parts that love water, you got these little parts that hate water, and then they just polarize so that they stick together, and what you have at the end of the day is a nice protective sac that stops things from coming in and out. And then you have little channels, little proteins sticking in it, so like kind of think of it as like doorways and ways to get in and out. So the important part of the cell membrane is it separates the cells from the environment. If we didn't have a cell membrane, all the organelles in the cell would just be able to float off, and we would never have those cells. And so really it just controls what goes in and out of the cell. And that's the important part of the cell membrane. Now it's not very tough, it's very loose and can kind of wiggle and go into any shape it wants. Think of it as like a plastic bag, right? It doesn't have a really strong structure to it. But it does control what goes in and out. Now in plants, we have something called the cell wall instead. Now this wall, I mean, this here just kind of looks like paper or cardboard. Well, that's basically what it is. Right? It has little fibers that kind of bind together to form kind of a hard shell. Think of like paper mache. Okay? And it maintains structure and shape, and it provides support. Now for plant cells, that's really important. I mean, they don't have bones and all those fun stuff for support. They have these really strong cell walls. Now the cell walls have lots of holes in them, so things can go in between them. They just provide lots of support. Think of it as like tent poles, right? So like the poles would hold the tent up really well, but things can still go in and out of the tent. It's the material that protects the tent, not the actual poles. It's just structure. Okay, and so cell walls are there for structure only, but they do not control what goes in and out, and they also do a very good job of protecting plant cells from danger, from damage. Okay, so again, cell walls are only in plants, but plants have the cell membranes, and so do animal cells. Okay. The nucleus, it's, when you look at the picture, which we'll see the big picture in a minute, it's like the big dark dot in the middle. It's the control center of the cell. Now, how does it control it? Well, it contains all the genetic material. So when you hear stuff like DNA and chromosomes and genes and all that stuff, we're just describing the genetic material on the inside, the DNA and the RNA, and it is all contained within the nucleus. And since all that DNA does is tell your cells how to work, well, it's the control center. It controls what your cell does. So it's the control center. We call that the nucleus. It's the same in chemistry. Nucleus is the center of the atom, right? So nucleus is going to be the center of the cell. So usually it's a piece that's right in the middle of the cell. Then we have what's called the cytoplasm. So this is a picture of a cell. You got the cell membrane, then you got the nucleus. Well, then you have all this kind of like jelly-like fluid that fills up the rest of the space. And I don't even know what the texture would be, like almost like an aloe gel, maybe, something like that. And it's just fluid found in the cell membrane and outside of the cell membrane. It has a lot of water in it as well. That's why we can say you're made mostly of water too, because your cell is mostly full of water. But your fluid found inside the cell membrane and outside the nucleus. So this is just your cytoplasm. Okay, and it's where the organelles just kind of float around and life-supporting material are located. So like the food and energy the cell needs is all inside the cytoplasm. All right. Now, attached to this nucleus, you have something called the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, we just shorten that to say ER, because, you know, who really wants to be saying this word all the time? Although I think it's kind of a nice word, endoplasmic reticulum. But you can just say it's the ER. So if you're ever doing an assignment or talking about biology and you say ER, they're going to know what you mean. It is a membrane, kind of like little sacs around the nucleus, and they kind of fold into pancake shapes like this. And what they do is they help transport material throughout the cell. Most importantly, they transport stuff from the nucleus to these little bumps, which we're going to learn about, are called ribosomes. So they're just helping to transport the genetic material to tell things how to build. But they're there for transports. Now these little bumps, they're called the ribosomes. Now the ribosomes are extremely important. They do all the work. So your whole body is made up of proteins. So all your cells, muscles, bones, everything is made up of proteins. And the ribosomes are what turn your DNA, well, it's really your RNA or messenger RNA. It turns your genetic code into proteins. And it's the ribosomes that are able to read the code from your genetic material and translate that into protein. And that's all done at the ribosome. So think of it as what actually produces all the protein in your body. So they're small spherical bodies. They can be free-floating or they can be attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, and we'll talk about what we call it when that happens when we look at the diagram, but nonetheless. So the ribosomes are making all this protein, and you're like, wait a minute though. If I'm doing work, shouldn't that take energy? Well, yeah. So we have something that makes energy for us. It's called the mitochondria. So the mitochondria is what ends up breaking down all the energy you eat and makes it energy available for the cell. And there we go, that's the mitochondria. It's also known as the powerhouse of the cell. Looks like a little bean, and if you take biology in grade 11 or 12, you're going to spend quite a lot of time learning about the formula for how it does this. And we know quite a lot about how mitochondria work. They're really, really cool little things, actually. Okay, and they're small bean-like shapes. Now, it's important I say bean-like because when we look at plant cells, you might end up confusing them with another organelle, but just look for the one that looks like a bean, and you're pretty sure it's the mitochondria. But they produce all the energy in your body, basically. Well, at least in your cells. Not in your body, but in your cells. Now we have what's called the Golgi body, or the Golgi apparatus. It kind of looks like the ER, but it's not attached to the nucleus. That's the key, right? It looks very similar. It's like these folded little sacs, but it's not on the nucleus, and that's the Golgi body. And what they do is when the ribosomes make the protein, they shoot them off into the cell, and the Golgi body grabs them and sorts and packs them so that they can get moved off to where they need to go. The protein themselves can't move because they're like a little building block, but the Golgi body absorbs it and is able to sort it out and figure out where it needs to go. Okay, so they're involved in sorting and packaging. Well, then we got these guys, which are vacuoles. Okay, and now in plant cells, they're actually quite large, or they can be quite large. In animal cells, they're actually kind of small, but they're basically fluid-filled sacs. Now, what are they filled with? Well, they're filled with food and water. Okay, that's what stores all the energy, or not the energy, sorry, the materials that the plant or the animal is going to need to do its thing. And if you think of a plant, I mean, they can go weeks without water sometimes, and they make quite a lot of food, so they got to store it, so they need bigger vacuoles. It's also what allows their cells to become quite hard, because the vacuoles get big and they push out against the cell wall, and that makes plant cells quite stiff. Okay? So they store food and water. Same thing in us. It stores food and water, and then they're very, very large in plant cells. Okay? So in a plant cell, they can take up I don't know what the number is, but I would say like 90% of the cell sometimes. It could take up a very, very large space. It's also why when you dry a plant out, let's say you pick some weeds in your garden and then you leave it out in the sun for a day, they actually shrink and become really tiny. It's because you've gotten rid of all the water, all of the vacuoles have emptied. And so the cells are 10% of their previous size, and that's why they get tiny. And that's why when you dehydrate food and stuff, it actually shrinks a lot. Okay. Chloroplast. Now these are the green parts in plants. So if you remember from grade 9 or grade 8, it's used for the absorption of light. Okay, it's only in plants, and it's a site of photosynthesis. It produces all that energy for plants, and then we eat the plants, or eat things that eat plants, and that's where we get our energy from. So all the stuff the mitochondria is breaking down comes from this chloroplast. Now, plant cells have mitochondria as well, so plants can eat themselves. They can eat their own energy. Alright, so again, used for absorption of light. So this is what turns light energy into chemical energy, i.e. food for us to eat. But only in plants, and these are green. Now, so they kind of look like mitochondria, right? But the mitochondria have a bean shape. These are not quite as flat. Now, if we go back to the Golgi apparatus, we said that it packages and sends off protein. Okay. Now, when a little piece of that Golgi gets pinched off, then we end up creating a little vesicle. And that's what transports material through the cytoplasm to wherever it needs to go. And it's just a small fluid-filled bilipid sac. So bilipid, remember when we looked at the cell membrane, it had those two layers. So it's just kind of two layers of what we call lipids, or little fats, and they fold around, and they end up creating these little sacs where we can shoot stuff off to other parts of the cell. And they transport it through the cytoplasm. Now, these things, obviously, they don't have like a little propeller and a rudder and somebody steering the ship, so how is it they're able to move? Well, within your cell, you actually have these little pathways, this little cytoskeleton. You have these little fibers that run throughout the cell, and these guys are able to kind of ride those fibers to go where they need to go. Okay? And that's your little cytoskeleton. Now, those things are so small, it's very hard for us to see, but sometimes in special cases, they kind of get really big and we can see them. And in fact, we're going to do mitosis eventually, which is the splitting of cells, and we're going to see kind of a similar sort of thing happen where you'll actually see it come out and grab stuff and move stuff around. But, they're there. So it's just a network of protein filaments and tubes that move things around in a cell given its structure. Now, I know that was an awful lot of information real fast, but don't panic. You're going to have time to write these out and deal with them, but let's see if we can start placing them on a diagram. Alright, so in a plant cell, this is what a typical plant cell would look like in terms of a diagram. Now, this obviously isn't a real picture. And let's go ahead and see if we can find them. So when we're looking at like the little dots, right? Okay, we're going to call those ribosomes. Now you notice that there's ribosomes on this little squiggly thing attached to the nucleus too, or they could be free floating. And remember, that is where we're making all the protein. Next up, we have what's called the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or the rough ER. And what the rough ER is, it's the endoplasmic reticulum, but usually on the end of it, or the outer layers, they have the protein attached to it. Or sorry, not the protein, the ribosomes attached to it, where we're making all the protein. When you have ribosomes attached to the endoplasmic reticulum, it looks like sandpaper. It looks like a smooth surface with a bunch of bumps on it, right? So we're just going to call it rough, because it has the ribosomes on it, and that's why we call it the rough endoplasmic reticulum. Now we have these little folds, which look similar to the endoplasmic reticulum, but they're not attached to the nucleus here. See, this is going to be the nucleus, right? So we're going to call that the Golgi body. Now below the Golgi, so there's the Golgi. Now we also have this shape here, which looks very similar to the Golgi, but is attached to the nucleus. So we got to go back and call it the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, because there's no bumps. Remember, if it has bumps, the ribosomes on it, it's the rough. No bumps, it's smooth. Now we have two little shapes like this in here. Now this picture doesn't really do justice to what I was telling you, but since we colored them green, we're just going to go ahead and call them the chloroplast, and it's just an organelle that floats free. Now we have the nucleus here. Now one of the words I didn't teach you was the difference between nucleus and nucleolus. So when you have the nucleus, you'll have a dark kind of blob, but then you'll also have an even darker spot in the middle. So the darker spot in the middle is called the nucleolus, and then the spot around the outside is called the nucleus. But if on a diagram you just label that the nucleus for me, hey, we're good to go. Okay, and that's where the actual plans are kept. Like, think of that as like the archive, the template, and then we do all the duplication of the DNA, or kind of the sending of the messages through the rest of the nucleus. Now here we have the outer layer of a plant cell, and it's the nice hard outside structure, so we're going to call it the cell wall. And right inside of it, lining it, is the cell membrane. So the cell wall gives structure and protects it, but then you still need the membrane to stop stuff from flowing in and out. Because remember, the cell wall does not stop things from going in and out, it simply protects the cell. Inside we have this big giant shape that holds stuff, so we're going to call that the vacuole, and see it has some different food stuff inside. This one is pointing towards this bean-shaped object in the middle, which is the mitochondria, or mitochondrion, I guess because it's singular form, but call it mitochondria, and that's what all the energy is produced at. And then last but not least, we have all this fluid that just kind of keeps everything together, and that would just be the cytoplasm. And there you go, that's a basic diagram of where all the cell organelles are. And we call them organelles because they kind of do what organs do for us. Think like your heart pumps blood, your brain thinks, your lungs breathe. And that's the same thing that's happening here in the cell. You have little tiny pieces that are doing different things for the cell, but yet, we're not going to call them organs because they're not organs, so we call them organelles. So there we go. That's the plant cell. Let's take a look at an animal cell. So that's what a plant is. Now you notice in the plant cell it has the large vacuole and the cell wall, and we're not going to see those in the animal cell. Okay, so here's an animal cell. And let's just go around and take a look. First off, we have something called a lysosome. Now I didn't teach you about that in the previous slides. What's important to know about the lysosome is that it's this little sac that contains an extremely strong fluid that when it breaks, it actually kills off all the cell. So when a plant grows, if it has a cell that doesn't work anymore, it just grows around it. Think of a tree trunk, it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But us, we don't want to keep getting bigger, we want to get rid of cells that don't work. So let's say you cut a cell and it doesn't work so well, and it has to go. Or maybe the cell's getting old and doesn't work well anymore, we want to get rid of the cell. And that's your body's kind of way of getting rid of the cell. It just pops this thing and done. Okay. Now the next thing we have are these little kind of bumps, these little things coming off of, we know this is the Golgi. Well, we're going to call them the Golgi vesicle, but they're just vesicles, right? Golgi vesicles, little pieces of the Golgi pinched off that are moving protein around. Okay, next one, well, we have this kind of flat sac hanging off the nucleus, and it's got the little bumps on it, so it'll be the same as the plant cell, which is the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER. And then we have the part of it that doesn't have the bumps, so we're going to call that the smooth ER. Now here we're pointing to the outside of the cell, which will be the cell membrane, or plasma membrane, which is called the cell membrane. Now you notice there's no cell wall on the animal cell, okay? No cell wall. Next, we have just the little dots that are floating around. They're the same thing that are on the ER, so those are the ribosomes. Now these little lines, bricks, they're not actually going to be that big, but they're just like those roads that kind of go throughout the cell, which we call the cytoskeleton. And then we have the mitochondria up here, the powerhouse. Now you notice in an animal cell, we don't have to see if it's a mitochondria or chloroplast, because we don't have chloroplast in animal cells. Animal cells do not do photosynthesis, so we just have the mitochondria. Below it is those flat flaps, but they're not attached to the nucleus, so we know that's the Golgi. Here again we have the nucleus and the nucleolus, and the last but not least, we have the fluid that kind of fills the cell and fills in all the space, is the cytoplasm. Now there's one that was labeled here, which is called the centrioles, and the centrioles you're going to learn all about when we talk about cell division and mitosis. Okay, but there's the labeling of the cell. There you go. So in our next video, we're going to look at making a model, and you want to stay tuned and follow that once you've gone through this video and feel comfortable with it.